Hello there everybody, my name is Bloomer Brown and welcome back to Simplerockets 2, a video game that I have found myself dipping in and out of more and more over the past couple of weeks. And following on from the success of the last video, I decided that I might as well hit record and try to start capturing some of what I have been getting up to. Now, it is a little known fact that when I was first getting into KSP, long before I ever attempted an interplanetary mission or even a moon landing, one of the first things that I learned to do was to rendezvous and dock in orbit. And I realized that that is something that I had yet to attempt in Simplerockets. So today I have decided to take on the challenge of constructing a small space station in orbit of the planet Jundroo, which in itself has proved to be something of a learning experience, as you will see later on. But it has gotten me very excited about some of the engineering aspects of this game when you compare it to Kerbal Space Program. Now, this first launch is of course going to put up something that we are going to be able to target and dock with, and is in itself a pretty basic space station core. Essentially it is a battery, a command pod and a couple of solar panels, and I think I've thrown in a little bit of monopropellant and a couple of linear thrusters as well, just to help orientate it into a proper position once we actually get up and rendezvous with it. And as we unfold the solar panels, it has to be said that it is looking pretty good indeed. Some of the eagle-eyed among you may have noticed that I dropped my first stage, even though I did have a little bit of fuel left in it, and typically that's not something that you really want to do. But this mission is also serving as a test of what I am going to be using as a standard launcher for all of the missions that I'm going to be running up to this space station, and I decided to put it through its paces and sort of simulate a less than ideal launch. I have of course adopted the standard Kerbal Space Program launch trajectory, even though it may not exactly be optimal. It does certainly mean that I have a lot less to remember when I am getting things up here. And there you can see me just trimming out the orbit and attempting to circularize it, and under the power of the RCS thrusters, as I start to reorientate the spacecraft for a second burn, I discovered that I have managed to circularize myself pretty well around 100 kilometers. And after a small amount of deliberation, I decide that I am pretty much finished with this engine and fuel tank, and I decide to stage it away. I have included a command chip on the top of this rocket, but unfortunately there are no reaction wheels or RCS thrusters. And as we slip away from the space station core, the solar panels glowing in the sunshine are probably more than enough to bring a tear to the eye of J.J. Abrams. Now, hitting time acceleration does seem to cause a few issues, and I think that there is something slightly buggy about those solar panels. They have been causing me no end of trouble when I have been launching up to rendezvous with this, and I have actually taken to folding them in before I attempt a mission up here. Now, if it is a case that you are a newcomer to the game, I should point out that the maneuver I am attempting here is a little bit risky. Now, after ejecting from the space station core, the booster is put onto a slightly different orbit. My advice would be not to attempt lighting the engine up as I am here, and instead to allow it to complete a couple of orbits around the planet, just to let the separation get a little bit wider, because as you can see we pass very, very close to the space station at a not inconsiderable speed, and we could have caused a little bit of damage there. So we did manage to get away with that, and I do make my re-entry into the atmosphere and end up plummeting straight down, crashing myself into the ground and creating a debris field somewhere out in the desert, far from any civilization. And so with a valid target in orbit, I decide that it is time to launch a second mission up and try to meet up with it and attempt a docking. Now, it is something of a design flaw that I have only managed to include one docking port on that space station core, and so what I have decided to do is to basically launch something of a docking truss, which is going to extend the capabilities of the space station. So what I have done is selected the space station core as a target, and once it is kind of rising over the horizon, I light up my engines and start flying up to meet up with this. Now, for any new players that may not have done something like this before, it is far more important that you concentrate on getting your spacecraft into orbit than actually getting a close encounter with the target spacecraft, because of course once you are in orbit, everything slows down, and you will of course have plenty of time to correct your orbit and basically bring yourself in for an encounter. Now, this is not going to be a tutorial on orbital rendezvous and docking, because I am of course still figuring out a lot of the game's mechanics myself, and I don't think that I am ready to start putting something like that together. So anyway, back to the launch. You can see that we are approaching the 3.5 kilometers per second that we need to put ourselves into a stable orbit. And once I am there, I notice that we are already going to be coming in pretty close, and I start plotting out a little bit of a maneuver that is probably going to involve some radial burning in order to sort of get these orbits to intersect and get me coming in pretty close to the space station core. Now, it is worth noting that getting in close is not the only challenge. You also want to be moving at a relatively slow velocity so that when you get in there, you're going to be able to stop in time. So there you can see me swing the spacecraft around and target my burn on the nav sphere. I'm not entirely sure what they're calling it in this game, but it basically functions in the same way as the nav ball. And there you can see me just starting to trim things down a little bit. And so rather than plotting out another burn, I decide to pass an orbit with the spacecraft and slowly chase it down, because we are in a slightly lower orbit than we should start to catch up pretty quickly. And once we get into a distance that I think is pretty reasonable, I decide that I am going to drop my booster and start making my approach using the RCS thrusters. Now, unlike in Kerbal Space Program, there are a couple of other considerations when designing spacecraft like this. Unfortunately, we are not able to select a docking port and use it as a control point and have the flight computer map all of our various controls based on that docking port. And so what I have had to do is strategically place a command chip on this upper stage just below the docking port, which means of course that the guidance for the orbital insertion was carried out using the command chip on the upper stage booster. And there you can see we are getting in pretty close now, and I switch over to the target space station and begin finagling around with the various controls, attempting to get it pointed in roughly the right direction. Unfortunately, this unsets my targeting system for the docking thrust that I'm trying to bring up, and I frantically start scrambling trying to select it as a target and get myself orientated once again. Now, because things were getting a little bit out of hand, I switched down to 1/4 speed, and unfortunately forgot to switch back to normal speed once I had gotten that sort of targeting issues sorted out, and so I end up taking on this docking at 1/4 normal speed, and by speeding the footage up to 4 times speed. I think that means that you are actually watching this in real time. The flight computer is quite useful in that it can keep you orientated towards the target spacecraft, which was something of an adjustment for me because I am used to controlling my orientation in KSP using the WASD keys and basically translating using the J, K, M and N keys, and it was a little bit of an adjustment, but the system actually does work pretty well. And so basically what I do is I try to keep everything lined up, and unfortunately because we are at 1/4 speed, the docking is taking a little bit of time, and I accidentally nudge the controls a little bit, which sends everything into a little bit of a spiral. But eventually I do make my way back in and we reach a solid docking. Now, it is worth pointing out that earlier attempts at this were a little bit unsuccessful because I didn't realise I was not going to be able to target my docking port and map my controls accordingly. And so over the course of the first attempt at this, I spent quite a considerable amount of time sort of dancing with this thing in orbit, attempting to get in for a docking, which was quite hilarious. It is of course worth noting that even NASA struggled with manoeuvres like this in the early days, and it wasn't until Buzz Aldrin wrote the book on Orbital Rendezvous that things started to get a little bit better. And so with the module successfully docked, I take a moment to sort of let things stabilize and start bringing out the solar panels in order to start generating some electricity for this thing, although it doesn't seem to yet be capable of recharging the battery. And I think that is something that I have messed up on myself, because I think I have to right click on the actual battery and basically instruct it to start refilling, which is a little bit unusual. And so with the success of that first docking, I mount a third launch up to the space station, delivering something that is approximating a sort of a habitation module. It's basically just an empty fuel tank with extra solar power and a couple of extra docking ports mounted on it for convenience, and I begin making my way in. And at this stage I am starting to get a little bit cocky with the whole thing, and as I slowly start to line things up and start coming in, I neglect my velocity and end up blazing past it and have to cover myself and start making my way in for a proper docking. Now, it is worth noting that once again I have folded away solar arrays because it is a situation that I've noticed that they seem to snap off once physics starts to load on the target vessel, which is a little bit unusual, and as I say, I think there are definitely some bugs associated with them. And the docking does go pretty well indeed, basically jiggling myself in and sort of eyeballing it in. Once again, the computer is very useful in keeping myself pointed, and eventually we achieve a hard dock. Though on closer inspection, it does seem that I have obstructed those docking ports on that truss, and perhaps I should have spent a little bit more time designing this on the ground before launching modules up to the space station willy-nilly. And so what I decide to do, in order to make things a little bit easier for any future missions up here, is to undock this crew cabin once again and slightly rotate it into a more suitable orientation before gently guiding myself back in and redocking with the spacecraft. Yes, it seems that this kind of thing is slowly starting to become somewhat routine, and I seem to be getting the hang of it. And so with the crew module once again fully docked, I bring out the solar panels and begin spending an orbit watching this thing slip gracefully over the surface of the planet before returning to deorbit the booster. And it has to be said that there are some truly spectacular images to be seen. I particularly like approaching sunset like that. Anyway, after a slightly unsuccessful deorbit maneuver where I skipped back into space for a moment, I finally get this thing into the atmosphere and fire up the engines to ensure that I am going to come in for a landing this time round. Now, you might have noticed that I have taken the liberty of installing a couple of parachutes on the booster this time, in an attempt to see whether or not I can actually recover this stage. Now, as I'm making my way down, you can see that the fuel tank starts to heat up a little bit, and I relight the engine in a bid to slow myself down. Now, what I should have actually done in that situation was angle my engine down slightly in order to kill off some of my vertical speed, but unfortunately I didn't do that. It would have given me a little bit more time in the upper atmosphere to slow down. Anyway, as I come down, I relight the engine a little bit and fire off the parachutes. I still do have a little bit of fuel left in that tank, and my intention is to use that to sort of cushion my landing on the ocean. I have got to say that I really do like the water effect in this game. However, as we will see, there are as many issues with this as there were with the water in KSP during the early days. And so coming in for a final approach, I light up the engines and we drop out of time acceleration. And I land successfully in the water and begin retracting my parachutes. The problem is though that this thing doesn't seem to be very buoyant and eventually exceeds some kind of limit and is destroyed. Though it does appear that one of the parachutes might still be floating around down there somewhere. Eventually I do manage to stop things from glitching out, and so with a few lessons learned, the next stage is of course going to be bringing some crew up to our new space station and perhaps launching a few other interesting modules as well. That though will be something that I think I am going to put out in another video. Until then, I'm going to take this opportunity to say thank you very much for tuning in. You have been watching Bloomer Brown on YouTube, and I will see you next time.